Welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here this evening for our CED lecture series. I wanted to start by just mentioning that the next lecture that will be presented here will be on April 9th from 4:30 to 5:30 with our very own Dr. Shang Wang, who's here. Her presentation will be on enhancing climate resilience in Georgia, flood mitigation, and nature-based solutions. So I hope that you all will attend that presentation as well. This evening we have David Spooner presenting Discovering the Small Town Feeling. He is a licensed landscape architect and associate professor in the CED. This year marks his 21st year at the college. He previously served as the BLA program coordinator and as the associate dean of academic affairs. And since stepping down from his administrative roles, he has focused his research efforts on seeing the built environment and using his camera and pen to document streets in St. Augustine, Florida, and several small towns throughout the Southeast. His talk this afternoon is about a way of seeing the rural built environment. Please help me welcome Professor Spooner.
I'm not used to applause in this. Can you all hear me okay with the mic? I hope. I think that's the best we're going to get. So thank you, Ashley, for the introduction. I actually am, and it's not always the case, but I am actually super excited to talk to you this afternoon. This is a project that's been in my head for about 2 years, and I haven't really publicly talked about it, although I gave a Cliff Note version of this in Cortona this past summer as a faculty member there, but I'm going to get much more into the nuts and bolts of it. And a lot more show and tell today. So, yeah, enough of that. Let's get going. Okay, let me get this going. So, I'll start off just by saying that small towns really get little respect, or they don't really get the respect that I think that they deserve. When you ask people about them, they usually say one of two things. They usually say, "Well, there's nothing there." And then if they think that something actually is there, they usually tell you that they're all the same. And I disagree, obviously, that's why I'm here today. My project attempts to address that, and as Ashley mentioned, Discovering a Small Town Feeling is about a way of seeing. It's more of a creative project than rigorous research with equations and those sorts of things. In John Berger's book, some of you may know it, Ways of Seeing, he states that the relationship between what we see and what we know is never settled. And I hope that my project contributes to that conversation, the ongoing conversation about rural places. I argue that the thing that contributes to a small town's lackluster status is actually the very thing that makes it so unique and special. And that thing I'm talking about is the built environment. And the goal of this project is to teach people to see it, right? So that they can discover it on their own as essentially a work of art. And I use art in a very specific way here, and I'll get to that in a minute. I intend for this project to become a book for ordinary people primarily, everyday people, but I also think it has a place in academia, but that's not necessarily where I'm aiming it. This afternoon or tonight, I'm going to break this talk into 3 pieces. I'm going to start with a bit of background in St. Augustine to set the context of what I'm doing on the main project. Of course, I'll talk about that, and I hope to get through this quickly so we have some time at the end for a little bit of show and tell and lots of questions. Okay, as I mentioned, the explanation of this project really begins in St. Augustine, Florida, 5 years ago exactly. If you remember 5 years ago, COVID was raging, and we were all trying to figure out how to teach stuff on Zoom. and hating it, at least I was, a colleague of mine, Ryland Steele, called me, and he said, asked me essentially if I'd be interested in working on a creative project in and about St. Augustine for this place, the Lightner Museum. St. Augustine, as most of you know, is the oldest city in the United States, and the museum director at the time was interested in having contemporary artists submit works about some contemporary aspect of the city. So Ryland and I put our heads together, and we decided what we were going to focus on is the built environment. This is the actual website that introduced the project. It's probably hard for you all to see it. I'm going to read the second sentence. It says, the project seeks to define St. Augustine through the residential streets and neighborhoods that have long been inhabited by the people that help support the city as a premier tourist destination. So as a tourist destination, St. Augustine presents itself, or at least the built environment of St. Augustine presents itself in a very, very specific way. And I'm talking specifically about this street in black. This is the historic district of St. Augustine. So Ryland and I wanted to show a different side of the city, not only to tourists, but also to the people who live there. We met in St. Augustine about 5 or 6 times, so this is late 2020, early 2021. We stayed 6 feet apart, I promise, and walked around the city. We literally walked pretty much every street that you're seeing on these maps and a few others that are off the map. I want to point out a couple of things. Again, St. George Street, the historic district. I'm going to talk about Oglethorpe Boulevard right here, and then 2 loops, and this is the Lightner Museum. This is the Lightner Museum right here, if you've not been to that particular city before. Okay, so I'm going to show you quickly a couple of images from Ryland, just so you have an introduction. Ryland is a professional photographer. He is the professor of photography at Columbus State. I've known him for years and years and years. Some of you in the room may know him. He is a UGA grad. And again, these are some of his images. Ryland photographs on a large format film camera. It's a really interesting process to watch if you're not familiar with that. If you're interested more about his portion of the project, you can just go to rylandsteele.com and take a look. As many of you know, I've taught a landscape photography elective at the CED for almost 10 years. I find pictures inspiring, and I find them really, really valuable to what I do as a landscape architect, because they can teach you something new about stuff you already know. And what I mean by that is captured in the 10 Rules of Photography by Martin Parr, who some of you might know his work, photographer, British photographer. Rule 1 says, look and learn from photography. Rule 8 says, get excited by what you have discovered. And that's really what photography does, at least for me. So it's this idea that we constantly see the world around us, but rarely do we stop and take the time to actually look at it. However, when you see the world in a frame, you see it differently, and that's where the learning comes in. So I'm inspired and learned by the work of this person. This is Thomas Struth's photograph. Stephen Shore. This photograph is hanging actually in the National Gallery of Art. I just saw it this past fall at the ASLA conference. Fred Herzog. William Eggleston. And Harry Callahan. So just to give you a sense of what I'm looking for. Okay, so back to St. Augustine. The problem with photographs, as much as I like them, is that they don't capture what I find so enduring and important and memorable about the built environment. There's a limitation on what photographs can teach you because of essentially what they are, a two-dimensional object. What I like to capture is the feeling of the street, and that requires movement. And this is what I mean. If anybody's prone to motion sickness, just stare at the center of the screen. Those 7 images represent 120 feet of St. George Street. Every person in St. Augustine knows this street. Every tourist knows this street. This is one of those streets that, again, St. Augustine sort of celebrates. It's like an amusement park ride in some ways. And when I say they know the street, what I mean is that they know how it looks and they know how it feels, because they walk up and down it. However, most people don't know the look and feel of many, if not most, of the other streets in St. Augustine. This is Oglethorpe Boulevard, and it's a completely different experience. Okay, and I wanted my portion of my exhibit at the Lightner Museum to focus on this idea. Each sequence can teach you something new about a place you already know. That was the idea behind it. And in my mind, each sequence was equivalent to one of Ryland's photographs. The question, of course, became, how in the world do you turn that into a museum exhibit? So for years, I've collected streets as a hobby. Here's a drawer full of them, and here's what I mean. So now that I see that, I realize I should have had a manicure before I filmed it. So in addition to making flip books, I have several down here. These are the mock-ups that I made, if you want to see one, maybe after the lecture. I made other things, right? This is a museum. And so my main exhibit was the three-panel display that you're seeing here in these slides. 7 streets are laid out horizontally across the panels. And the third street from the bottom is St. George Street, the one I just showed you. And the idea was that you had to use your feet, essentially, to experience motion hanging on a wall, if that makes any sense. So the streets started, this is St. George, starts here and goes this way. And it's here, goes this way, and then this way, and then this way. And the idea is that everybody knows that street. So it gives you the opportunity to kind of ground yourself in it and then start comparing and contrasting other streets. I had exhibits like this that were digital loops. Here's an example. This is in my office. This is not at the museum. Okay. And then at the last minute, I threw in some drawings, these 4. These are drawings that show single scenes at the ends of streets. The drawing at the lower left looked like this on the wall of the Lightner during the opening. And at the opening, this is the important part, I learned a ton. I've never done this before, right? What I learned, number one, is that people got it. They understood what I was trying to do, and they saw the visual impacts of movement without moving. So that was pretty cool. Number 2 is, as I learned, that people look at different kinds of art differently. And if you really want people to look at something, and I mean really look at it, draw it. They look at photography different. They look at videos different. And then number 3, I learned from this exhibit that people, ordinary people, are really interested in streets. They're really interested in urban design in the built environment. But they don't have the first clue how to talk about it. They don't know the terminology. So all 3 of those lessons influenced my approach to the project I'm getting ready to talk about. Everything in this project is hand-drawn, and I use drawing sequences to teach ordinary people about the rural built environment. Okay, I'm going to transition now to the current project, but maybe is there a question, anybody, a comment anybody wants to make about St. Augustine? Okay, sure.
When you made the decision to do photos in black and white for that display room, why did you decide to do black and white instead?
Because I didn't want to compete with Ryland. The question was, why did I choose black and white? And I could have chose color, but when you're viewing sequences like this, multiple images, if it's color, it just gets to be too much. And Ryland was, he's a professional photographer. Like, they don't want to see mine. They want to see his. Color works. So I stayed away, black and white. Okay, it's a great one. I'm going to move on. Scott. Oh.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the technology of a flip book or animation and seeing all the images laid out? I mean, that seems like actually a really different experience for the viewer.
Yeah, so I could answer it a couple of ways. The camera limits you with a focal length, and I'll talk about this at the very end, but I'm using a 35 millimeter focal length, which matches the human eye straight ahead. So of course, it's a little bit different than what you're going to see when you're out there. Movement, I could have easily just videoed the thing and showed videos, but there's something more interesting to me about the ability to kind of skip through it. stop and see it. So that was how that kind of came together. Okay? I'm going to move on, and then maybe we can chat some more. So the book. I was talking to Sonia one day, Dean Hurt, this is back in 23, about a very different book idea that I had, and she asked if I'd ever read this one. This book, The Largest Art, presents cities as having hidden layers that contribute of meaning, so hidden layers of meaning that contribute to an artistic outcome of what they are. It's a really good book, but it focuses exclusively on cities, and it ignores another significant component of the built environment, which of course is small towns. Cities really do get all the attention, all the research attention. If they are the largest art, then I argue that the 29,000 small towns across the United States should be considered individual works of art. Small towns are everywhere, but we rarely consider their significance in the built environment. In Georgia alone, for example, there's 535 incorporated cities, towns throughout the state. 391 of them, or a full 73%, are home to 10,000 people or less. So there's a lot of them. And I thought I'd like to address that opportunity. And so this idea in my head started of what about the smallest art instead? What makes small towns special? What unique artistic layer do they have that cities don't? And that's when the small town feeling immediately came to my mind. It's not a way you describe Atlanta, for example. So the title of the project is intentional. Discovering is directly related to the pedestrian discovery process, which is an urban design thing. I define the small town feeling the following way. Hard to read the quote, I'll read it for you. It says, the feeling is often attributed to the close-knit social ties between people and a familiar, friendly, and laid-back lifestyle. Small towns feel smaller, shorter, and slower than their urban counterparts. And the small town feeling exists when the things we see fit how we see them. Fit refers to an environmental psychology term. This is the person-environment fit theory, sometimes called habitability, sometimes called congruence or goodness of fit. I use fit in my book more as a way of seeing, although there's some parallels between the two. And I'll talk about this much more in a few minutes. But first I'm going to kind of start on the discovering part and talk about it and how it works. I first learned about the pedestrian discovery process as a component of urban design from this book. A couple of quotes. Exploration is a human need in a Abraham Maslow kind of way. A sense of discovery can be enhanced by design. Some places have been designed to create a sense of discovery. If you read the book, he talks about the cannery in San Francisco as that example. And then the last quote ties directly to my book. Ultimately, the readiness for discovery lies within each of us, waiting to be evoked in public places. I rely on these books to explain the process, the discovery process in the built environment. John Stilgoe reminds us that we should just go for the going. Rebecca Solnit encourages us to explore, to find what you don't know that you're looking for. And Dr. Keltner challenges us to find awe in the places that we visit. And he brings up the subject of awe walks in his book. I illustrate the discovery process as follows. This idea that our curiosity leads to exploration, and as we explore, we discover new things, which leads us to a new understanding about the world around us. And then you repeat it. I use Gordon Cullen's theory of serial vision to illustrate how this works in the built environment. This is an image from his book, Townscape. Cullen talks about serial vision in the following way. He says buildings and the spaces between them exhibit an art of relationship whenever the two weave together in a way that causes drama to be released. The drama that Cullen talks about is a felt contrast between the existing view and the emerging view. Each sketch from his book represents a moment where that happens. I think of each sketch as a photograph. So if you look, for example, from here to here to here, that's the first three images right there. Okay. 5 years after Cullen wrote his book, James Gibson wrote his theory on perception. And I directly tie Gibson's theory to Cullen's serial vision to help explain what I mean by the small town feeling. Gibson claims that the built environment is not comprised of individual objects, like a building or a tree, in terms of perception. But what he says is the built environment is really a continuous background that is seen behind the edges of foreground objects. And he uses the term visual array to describe what is seen from a given position, and then he uses the term occluding edge to describe any object that blocks that view. The idea is that when you walk forward, so starting on the left, the occluding edges of the door frame open like curtains on a stage to reveal a new visual array or emerging view if you're Cullen. Here's how it works in motion. Okay, got it? So when you apply all this, Gibson's theory, Cullen's ideas to the small town, some interesting things happen. Here's an example in Crawford, Georgia. Occluding edges, obviously, are the building and the roof and the pole. Right? Here's an overhead example in Isla, Georgia. Here's an example along the facade wall in Comer, Georgia. And sometimes things that hang off buildings create occluding edges. Here's an example right here, Athens. Okay. Occluding edges are everywhere. And because they're everywhere, nobody ever really sees them. So learning how to see them is very important. Learning to see them, period, is important. But how you see them matters even more. So in my book, I say people tend to walk where there are places to walk. Very similar to a William White statement about people tend to sit where there are places to sit. So I'm talking about crosswalks and sidewalks. And if that walk brings you to viewing position 1, this is the visual array. If that walk that is designed in that town brings you to viewing position 2, that's what you see. And when you apply this to a specific building in a town, the way that you're made to see a building changes how you discover things about it. It makes complete sense to see this building, for example, a symmetrical building along its central axis. However, when you see it another way, you discover some different things about it. So let me show you how this works in a small town. This is a figure ground diagram of Lexington. If you don't know what a figure ground diagram is, the black things are buildings, the white is the landscape, roads, walks, trees. Okay. Lexington has 10 buildings and 2 intersections. And I'm going to focus on this building right here. I'm going to approach it from the west and approach it from the south. Here's the west. Here's the south. Okay? And you may be sitting there asking yourself, what's the big deal? And there may not be one, honestly. But I argue that if you learn to see small towns this way, you eventually will discover a good sequence. I think of it as trying to find a good photograph. If there's any photographers in the room, you know what I'm talking about. You're just out looking, constantly looking. And I think this is what Stephen Shore, Ryland, Fred Herzog, William Eggleston, Harry Callahan are trying to do. Crawford, Georgia, 3 miles to the west of Lexington, is made up of 7 buildings and 1 3-way intersection. So in Lexington, I showed you how 1 building is seen differently. In this example, I'm going to show you how 7 buildings in 1 3-way intersection are looked at differently. First of all, this is a photograph of the intersection. If you've never been there, G Brand Barbecue is on the right. This is my sketch of that same intersection. So back to St. Augustine for a minute. Do you see how you look at photographs differently than drawings? That's what I'm getting at. I don't know anything about that, so if you do, let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it. Okay, here's the approach from the south. Notice how the occluding edge is open to reveal that building. Approaching from the west. Approaching from the south, but turning east towards Athens. Okay. Now, no other town looks and feels exactly like Crawford, which to me makes it unique and worth discovering. Okay. So that's the discovery process that I'm talking about. Next, I'm going to talk about the small town feeling. I start by talking about fit. I actually go backwards in the book. I start here and go here. I talk about fit, and then I use movement sequences in the book to show how small towns feel smaller, shorter, slower, more familiar, more friendly, and social. The explanation of fit begins with this guy, Henry Dreyfuss, who is considered to be the father of industrial design. In 1929, he wrote the book that you're looking at, and he said that the ideal design outcome for any object occurs when the object's size, form, and configuration match or fit human dimensions. So he and his staff measured thousands and thousands of people to figure out how to design a wide variety of products. He measured hands, feet, how people sit to figure out exactly how to make you fit in a car, grip a steering wheel, and hit the brake. Okay. He also used these same measurements to design thousands of consumer products, telephones, teapots, toasters. One of the most important things, to me at least, Dreyfuss did is he figured out how people see. And we see, all of us, exactly the same way. And I use this fact as a foundational basis for discovering the small town feeling. Dreyfuss never designed a city, a town, or a building, so we don't have one of these really nice data sheets on how to do it. However, if we use his approach to create one, I would argue that the result would look a lot like, if not exactly like, a small town. And this is what I mean when I say the small town feeling exists when the things we see fit how we see them. So in a Henry Dreyfuss kind of way, what's the best way to view a building? So if your name is Aristotle, you say the best way is in its entirety and through its details simultaneously. Seeing an object whole is ideal for understanding its unity and composition, and then our ability to see the intricate details is critical to knowing any object that we look at. To see a building both ways is tricky, given the optical range of the human eye. And Dreyfuss discovered that the maximum eye rotation is 30 degrees above horizon, and 25 degrees above horizon is ideal for human comfort. So, arguably, the proper angle for seeing an object in its entirety and through its details is something like 27 degrees. And this angle, as it turns out, becomes kind of important. This sketch shows you how a building along Main Street in Lexington is viewed at a 27-degree angle. At a 27-degree angle, the building can be seen as a whole, but you also can make out individual details, window displays, etc. As I mentioned, Dreyfuss never designed a building, a city, or a town, but German architect Hans Mertens did. And as far as I know, he's the first person that I've ever read about that applied a 27-degree angle to a city to figure out the most desirable vista in the built environment. And he began with a really clever assumption that the maximum viewing distance or vista in a city ought to be the same distance where one person can recognize another. And his research led him to understand that number is 72 feet. Okay. He applied the 27-degree angle to that. So over here, this would be your eye level. And he applied that angle to figure out what the matching building height ought to be to see it whole and through its details. And that number is 36 feet. At 48 feet, the corresponding building height would be 24 feet tall, and at 24 feet, the corresponding building height would be around 12 feet tall. So it's this one's 36, right? 24 and 12. When you apply it, well, so if you believe it, right, and you apply it to a small town, it's a near perfect fit. This is Lexington. So if you believe all of this, and that the small town feeling might exist when the built environment fits the human field of view, then limiting building heights to 3 stories and keeping the viewing distance to 72 feet or less becomes important. And this is precisely how many, if not most, small towns, at least in Georgia, are built. Carnesville, Isla, Comer, and Lexington all do that. Okay? So there's a little more here. In a Henry Dreyfuss kind of way, what's the best way to feel the spaces between buildings? There's actually been a lot written on this topic. And I'm going to focus on the first one. This is Erno Goldfinger's book, because he started the whole conversation about this in 1941. What he wrote is, to have significant spaces, again, felt spaces, you must have definitive enclosure, and that the size, shape, and character of the enclosure determines the quality of the space. So Goldfinger felt that that felt quality of the built environment should be called, and is called, in his words, the sensation of space. Today, Goldfinger's sensation of space is known as enclosure, which is always expressed in a ratio between the vertical height and the horizontal width of a space. And it's agreed, when I say it's agreed, I mean it's agreed by most of these folks, that enclosure, that sensation of space is felt when the ratio of enclosure falls between 1:1 and 4:1. Above 4:1, it goes away. Closer than 1:1, some people claim it's too claustrophobic. So there's a range. If there's a range, then there should be a good fit. What's ideal? What's the ideal fit? Most of those researchers will tell you that 2:1 is. And the reason they say this is because when you're at a 2:1 ratio, exactly half your view is blocked by the building and half your view isn't. And it's the perfect balance. This is what the ratios look like when they're applied to Isla, Georgia. The gray area represents the portion of the sight line blocked by a building. So if you look closely at 2:1, what do you notice? The magic 27-degree angle comes back again. As it turns out, anytime you stand twice as far away as the building is tall, it forms a 27-degree angle. This is what a 2:1 ratio in a 27-degree angle look like on a second-story or two-story building at Isla. And this is what that looks like when you stand away from it, twice as far away from it. So if you're keeping track here, right, the best way to look at a building and the best way to feel a building is essentially the same, if you believe this, okay? Again, I didn't write this. This is what other people wrote. Oddly, one thing that nobody has talked about is what happens when you adjust the horizontal viewing distance to 1 or 2 stories instead of the entire building. Most of the time when we talk about a 1:1 ratio, we're talking about one of these to one of these. But what if you limit it to V1 or V2? What happens? This is what those ratios yield in terms of an associated view. The sense of enclosure is really quite high because the entire building blocks your view outwards. However, the position allows you to see the details of the building quite well. The only research I found on this subject comes from Jan Gehl's paper, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, Close Encounters with Buildings. Here's the quote. "It's best if pedestrians meet interesting and varied experiences as they pass by." Okay, let's pass by. Okay. The walking route, the configuration of that walking route, and the ratio of enclosure do force a close encounter with that building. And this is important because it does impact the sensation of space, the felt sensation of space in Lexington. It also impacts the perceived size and speed of the built environment. And remember, from the definition that I gave, small towns tend to feel smaller, shorter, and slower than their urban counterparts. So 4 years after Gehl wrote his paper, he wrote this book, and he turned his idea into a standard very similar to how Henry Dreyfuss made standards, or created standards. He says physiological studies show that our senses need stimulation at fairly short intervals of 4 to 5 seconds. So at an average walking speed of a human, which is 3 miles per hour, we can cover 20 to 25 feet in 5 seconds. This means that there should be a noticeable difference, again an urban design term, between the existing view and the emerging view about every 20 feet. This establishes a rhythm. And according to this, it's a rhythm that would fit people. Of course, if you apply it back to Lexington, you can see it's a near perfect fit. Right? Notice the gray building. There it is. The building comes and goes in less than 20 feet in about 5 seconds to reveal the next emerging view. So the amount of visual complexity and how fast you move through the built environment seem to be the main 2 variables at play here. On the left, the quote says, "Speed affects time and distance estimates and is judged in terms of the rate of information flow." The next quote says, "The more information and the more to be experienced results in a perceived slower passage of time." When people perceive a slower passage of time, they generally think of the walk as being shorter, which translates usually to smaller, which again fits how we think about small towns. The way that I illustrate this in the book is I use a sequence from Plains, Georgia. The built environment of Plains contains 8 buildings arranged in a linear fashion. So these 8 buildings are here. Now notice that overhead structure all the way. Now the curious thing is that the average person walks 260 feet in 1 minute at 3 miles per hour. And as it turns out, Plains is almost exactly 260 feet long. So you can walk Plains in 1 minute from here to here. However, when you do walk it, because there's so much to see and experience, you perceive it as a much slower passage of time. Here's what I mean. So notice how many occluding edges there are on the overhead plane and the 2 vertical planes. This is what happens when you put it in motion. Okay, that was just 140 feet of planes. When you walk the entire length, it will feel smaller, shorter, and slower. If you walk the next 260 feet, it's going to feel much longer and larger because there's not much to look at. Additionally, the day I walked it, it was about 850 degrees in Plains, so it was bad. Okay. All right, time for a little bit of audience participation. When I was a kid, I used to come home from nursery school, 1st grade, and let myself in. This is 1970, so it was safe to do that back in those days. I'd turn on the TV. Sesame Street would be on. How many of you know Sesame Street? All right, we're good. They had a little skit. It had a little jingle to it, and it was called, "Which one of these doesn't belong with the other?" And they would show you an orange, a banana, and grapes, and broccoli. Which one's broccoli? I heard it, bottom right. Every single time I show this slide, the Land 1500, the room's packed. Guess what comes up? Bottom right. What's up with that? I explain it by using these books. The first one is more of a philosophical explanation. Let me back up. Y'all, all of these buildings are in Winterville, Georgia, every single one of them. So I use these 3 books to explain it. The first one is a philosophical overview, like a 100,000-foot idea that architecture can make you happy. The second and third book have some design criteria in it in a Henry Dreyfuss kind of way. I'm going to start with Jonathan Hale's book, The Old Way of Seeing. So Jonathan Hale calls this familiar and friendly aspect of architecture the old way of seeing. And he claims that this building from his book has it. He claims that it's a building that you find yourself wanting to look at. 150 feet down the same road is this building. And in the book, he says that he walked by this building 4 times before he even noticed it, which is a way of saying it does not have the old way of seeing. In the rest of his book, he goes on to talk about why that is. One of the reasons why that is, according to him, is that when buildings like this one have a series of regulating lines, which are the black lines superimposed over the photograph, they form a familiar pattern. And that familiar pattern ties itself to this idea of the old way of seeing. I think the Little Baked Bakery in Ella J has the old way of seeing. And when I look at it, these are some of the patterns that I carve it up with to make it seem familiar. There's more ways. Donald Ruggles in the other book discusses the well-known 9-square pattern in architecture. It's the tic-tac-toe board on the left. In his book, he shows how this pattern is seen in many, many famous buildings, works of art like Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Mona Lisa, and if anybody in here is an Edward Hopper fan like I am, he shows it on Nighthawks. Okay. His research, his own research, suggests that there's a familiarity and a friendliness to this pattern, which he ties directly to the human face. It's a little bit of a stretch, I'll admit. But again, this is what it looks like when you apply the 9-square pattern to that building. Okay? This is what happens when you put it in motion. So the building kind of greets you like an old friend. So that's basically part one of my book. I didn't go over everything, but the idea is that you take urban design principles and you apply them to the small towns as a way to teach people how to see it. The second part of the book, which is Images in Motion, is nothing more than a bunch of case studies where I ask and allow people to walk down different streets. I think I've got 3 or 4 case studies to show you. Each one of those case studies begins with a figure ground diagram and an indication of where the sequence occurs, which is the gray circle. This is Cornelia, Georgia. I always add some sort of representative view as a way to introduce the town. Think of it like a photograph that Ryland or Stephen Shore would put together. Sometimes in each case study, I give a direct explanation and tell the reader exactly what to look for. And most of the time, I don't. I just let them discover it on their own in a Where's Waldo kind of a way. Here's Cornelia. Here's Bowman, Georgia, northeast of Athens by about 30 minutes. They've got this awesome mural on the side of their building. This is what it looks like when you're on the street. Left turn. Heading down towards Comer, right there. Just real quick, back up. Every 20 feet, right there on the left, you can get a book. 20 feet later, you can get a Pepsi. 20 feet later, you can get an ice on your way down. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. Hot off the press. I just drew this one over spring break while everybody else was at Panama City or whatever you're doing. This is the longest sequence in the book so far. It's not the Little Baked Bakery, but it's a pretty nice way to end a sequence. Back up and just show you, back up and show you what I'm looking at. One of the things. This street, sorry for getting sick, everybody. This street right here has a very distinct character right through here. You go underneath this awning overhead, and it's a completely different character, right, in one street before you turn and end. These are the kinds of things I wish people would discover. Carnesville, Georgia. This is up Highway 106. Okay. So on the left column, these are the towns in Georgia that I used to, again, in part one, to describe the small town feeling. The towns in the middle column are towns that I have case studies for, drawn and complete. The ones in progress are the 4, Brunswick, Montezuma, Fort Valley, and then I'm looking for others. I need about 10 more for 24 total. I want to talk a little bit about the process. I start this whole thing by looking at satellite images of cities. This is Montezuma, Georgia. And when I look at this thing, I already know immediately, I'm going right there. I know that there's a noticeable difference right there. I'm on that crosswalk looking this direction. And so, of course, with Google Earth, you can put yourself there. Now it confirms it. I'm on the middle of the street, which is too bad, but it's this sequence, probably to the left, but maybe across the street, is a noticeable difference that I know I don't have yet in the collection that would be the case studies in the book. So I'm going to take a trip there at some point. But I always start with these satellite images and look to see kind of what might be there. I pack up my gear and hit the road. I typically use a 24 millimeter tilt shift. This is this camera and lens. Tilt shift corrects for parallax. If you've ever taken a photograph of a building, couldn't get it in frame, so you lean back, your photograph will look like the building's falling over. This lens fixes that for you. I bring usually a 16 to 35 millimeter zoom. It's this lens. This is the tilt shift. A light meter, because this is a manual lens. This is a loop, magnification loop, because I can't see anymore. Batteries. 2 cameras, because when I was a Boy Scout or a Cub Scout, somebody said 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And I have driven somewhere for 5 hours and my camera didn't work. That was a bad day. Of course, when I get there, I take the pictures of the things I think I need to see, but oftentimes you discover other things when you're there. I use a 35 millimeter focal length. This is what I was talking about when Scott asked his question. I use 35 millimeters because it fits essentially the human view. So each circle represents what the eye would see, again, in a Henry Dreyfuss kind of way. And then the red box is essentially what the frame of a camera would be. So if you fill the frame, which is a photography term, literally at 35 millimeters, what you see is what you get. And that's how I photograph it. Now, showing motion in a book is really hard, so I use a technique called the scroll method in order to show and represent movement on a two-dimensional surface. Reading these things is a little bit weird. You have to start at the bottom and then read up like this, like this, like this. And the idea is that the next subsequent image pulls you forward into the space. It takes some getting used to, but once you kind of find your pace with it, you'll learn to see motion without moving. And then the other thing that I do is it's intentional. The gap is representative of Jan Gehl's idea, which is this 5-second interval, 20 feet. And the idea behind this is that you can compare Ellijay to Comer, to Culbert, to any of the others as you go. This is in my office. This is where I draw everything. Once I'm done drawing everything, I put them on the floor. Those are my feet. Put them in order, make sure everything's real nice, scan it, take rasters to vectors, drop them in. So this is a case study for Carnesville. So this would be like page 1, page 2. Flip this page, you get this, that, and then you end right there. Okay. How much time do I got? About 10 minutes. Real quick, y'all. Real quick. So just real, I want to show, this is, again, there's no graphic design here. This is me putting this thing together. But this is what the book is looking like right now. You recognize a lot of this. Some of it I've talked about, some of it I didn't. What I want to do is kind of chase forward to the case studies. Okay, so here's a case study. This is what it would look like. Bowman, I showed you this one. What I'm after is this right here. And again, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but try to look and use that method to get the sense of motion. Each person does it slightly differently, but in the book I remind people about every 5 seconds is when you should shift your view. Okay, Carnesville, you saw this one. Concord, this is an interesting little town, one building town, 318 people in this town. Cornelia, you saw this one. Donaldsonville, way down south. I have another drawing for the right. Ellijay, I actually did 2 streets in Ellijay. Molina, and the last one is Zebulon, right here. Okay. One last thing. So I've submitted this proposal to this publisher right here, and I'm happy to report that they have said yes to publishing it, but there is a problem, which I'll explain in a second. I just want to show you what they do. This is Loriolin's book in Italy, and what's so great about this press is that, yes, I like cookies. It's just a really gorgeous set of book when they print it. The problem with the press, in any book, honestly, that has lots of photos in it, even though mine aren't color, is it's really, really expensive to get these things off the ground, and the author has to come to the table with money. It's not unlike a photo book to warrant a $30,000 upfront fee. Now, mine's not that high, but it's close. So the next phase of this is to talk to the editor, which will be Friday this week, and start to see what we can do, and then work on figuring out what kind of grants I could write to make it happen. But this project to me has been like in my head for years, but really in the last 2 years, and I've just had a ball doing this. I love this stuff. Like, it's so therapeutic to take photographs and draw. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks for listening, everybody.